In 1991, Justice Clarence Thomas appeared before this committee in one of the most disgraceful performances by the Senate Judiciary Committee in our nation's history. Justice Thomas rightly described the treatment he got from then-Chairman Joe Biden and Senate Democrats as a, quote, high-tech lynching. It is sad to see 30 years later this committee is again engaged in the same despicable tactics. Senate Democrats and their lapdogs in the media are engaged in a twofold political campaign. Number one, to delegitimize the Supreme Court of the United States because they are angry that there are a majority of constitutionalists on the court. But number two, very directly, this is a political campaign designed to smear Justice Clarence Thomas. And the reason is simple: the left despises Clarence Thomas. And they do not despise him because he's a conservative. The left despises Clarence Thomas because he is a conservative African American. Here's what Clarence Thomas said at that confirmation hearing. He said, if you are a free-thinking African American, quote, you will be lynched, destroyed, and caricatured by a committee of the U.S. Senate. Well, in 3 decades, that hasn't changed, and it's gotten worse. And to be clear, here's the left's view. I point to one article just 3 weeks ago. The Democrats need to destroy Clarence Thomas's reputation. They'll never successfully impeach him, but so what? Make him a metaphor for every insidious thing the far right has done to this country. That's what the left is trying to do. And I will tell you, if you look at the next poster board, the left has repeatedly attacked Clarence Thomas with a racism. This is a magazine cover that showed Justice Scalia every bit as conservative as Clarence Thomas, but he's portrayed as the master, and Clarence Thomas, in a bigoted attack, is portrayed as shining his shoes. I'll show you another one to give you a sense of the racist vitriol from the left. Here's a racist caricature of Clarence Thomas, lawn jockey for the far right. This is the bigoted contempt the left has. I'll show you another magazine cover. Offensively, this is how the left views Clarence Thomas. Now, it's important for people at home to understand this is not about judicial ethics. You can take those down. This is not about judicial ethics. This is not about rules that should apply to judges across the board. We could have a reasonable discussion about that. This is about applying a double standard to Clarence Thomas and only Clarence Thomas. The attack that my Democrat colleagues breathlessly repeat is that Clarence Thomas stayed at the vacation home of a very close friend of his, a successful Texas businessman, flew on his plane, and went on his yacht. Well, if that's the standard, going and traveling and being paid for by others, then guess what? Just about every Supreme Court justice has done so, and done so in much greater numbers. Justice Thomas was appointed in 1991. In the time since then, he's taken 109 reported trips, 5 international trips. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg was appointed in 1993, 2 years later. In the time she was on the court, she took 157 trips, including 28 international trips. Mr. Payne, yes or no, do you think Ruth Bader Ginsburg was corrupt?
No.
Nor do I. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was not alone. Justice Stephen Breyer, appointed the year later in 1994, took 233 reported trips, including 63 international trips. Again, yes or no, Mr. Payne, do you think Stephen Breyer was corrupt?
No.
Nor do I. I would point out Justice Kagan has done the same thing. Justice Sotomayor has done the same thing. And yet none of my Democrat colleagues care, because this is a political attack directed at a justice they hate. And by the way, let's spend a moment focusing on Justice Stephen Breyer, a delightful human being, someone I know personally, someone who served decades on the court. Justice Stephen Breyer repeatedly traveled on the penny of a prominent Democratic billionaire, the Pritzker family. Now, J.B. Pritzker is the Democrat governor of the state of Illinois, from which our chairman hails. I would be shocked if the chairman of this committee has not had multiple meals with the Pritzker family. Justice Breyer was a longtime member of the board that awarded the Pritzker Architecture Prize. Now, what did that mean? That meant Justice Breyer traveled on the dime of these Democrat billionaires. In 2019, Justice Breyer traveled to New York City, to Vancouver, and Paris. In 2018, Justice Breyer traveled to Ireland and Spain. In 2016, he traveled to New York, Spain, and France. In 2013, he traveled to Norway, Sweden, Denmark. In 2012, he traveled to Beijing and to London. All of this paid for by the Pritzker Foundation. Now, none of my Democrat colleagues are mad about this, and let me be clear. I'm not suggesting Justice Breyer is corrupt. What I'm suggesting is this committee is corrupt because this is a kangaroo circus, and I will note we had 15 Senate Democrats, including 6 members of this committee, send a letter to the Appropriations Committee threatening to cut off the funding for security at the Supreme Court. The left is willing to threaten the lives of the justices. Justice Samuel Alito this weekend in the Wall Street Journal said that the attacks directed at the justices are making them targets of assassination. This is disgraceful. Every senator who signed this letter should be embarrassed. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that this letter be admitted into the record and also that the interview with Justice Alito from this weekend be entered into the record. Democrats can have disagreements based on law, but this attempt to delegitimize the court, this attempt to personally smear Clarence Thomas is dishonest, and everyone in the media echoing it is participating in a shameful reprise of 1991's high-tech lynching. Mr. Delaney, this hearing's not going well for you. And there's a reason for it. Because as much as you may be concerned that it's not going well for you, it's gone far worse for Chessie Prout. The focus of this discussion began when a 15-year-old freshman was sexually assaulted by a senior as part of a campus custom known as Senior Salute, a game where upperclassmen competed to have sex with younger students. In 2015, the culprit was acquitted of felony rape, but found guilty of misdemeanor sexual assault and endangering the welfare of a child. You have repeatedly said you were just an advocate. You were just representing the school, where the school was St. Paul's, one of the most prestigious boarding schools in America. And yet, in your representation of St. Paul's, it was St. Paul's that was the victim. You portrayed the school that a sitting U.S. Senator, indeed a member of this committee, attended. Former Secretary of State John Kerry attended. Former FBI Director Robert Mueller attended. A member of the Kennedy family and 3 Vanderbilts have attended. And in your view, that school was the victim, not the 15-year-old girl who was sexually assaulted. Your response to Senator Hawley was, I was just representing my clients. Well, I'll tell you, Mr. Delaney, you represented your clients very poorly. Because as a lawyer, if your client is a school and they've decided their strategy is to out the girl that was sexually assaulted while in their care and custody, that school is doing a crappy job, and the lawyer who goes in and says, sir, yes, sir, happy to do it, is doing a lousy job representing his client. Now, just a moment ago, you answered questions from Senator Corner. I actually wrote down a couple of things. Earlier in the day, you acknowledged very kindly that the Prout family, I'm quoting you, the Prout family had a strong interest in anonymity. And then just a moment ago, you answered Senator Corner, I wrote it down again, the school did not file a motion to remove anonymity. Mr. Delaney, that testimony is false. I want to read from the motion you filed that is right here. This is on page 2. The school recognizes that JD has an interest in protecting her anonymity. Now notice you told this committee the Prout family had a strong interest. Oddly enough, the word strong was not in your pleading. You graciously conceded they have an interest. Okay? However, in balancing that interest against the prejudice to the school and the public interest in disclosure, the following common sense measures should be taken to mitigate the prejudice to the school, the victim, elite private boarding school. The school shall be entitled to identify plaintiffs and JD during discovery. Plaintiffs and JD should not be allowed to proceed under pseudonyms at the trial of the matter. You asked the court, strip her anonymity. And you just told Senator Cornyn, I didn't ask the court to strip her anonymity. Why did you give a false answer to Senator Cornyn?
Senator Cruz, thank you for the question. I did not in any way intend to provide any misleading answers. The section of the brief that you're referencing involves the use of a pseudonym at trial as opposed to at pretrial phases of the case. And I'm not aware of...
And so your view is it's common sense, that's the word you used, that a teenager, the victim of sexual assault, should be stripped of a pseudonym. That's just a common sense step.
No, I'm saying that First Circuit precedent treats the use of fictitious names before a jury at a trial quite differently than it does at pretrial phases.
So Mr. and Mrs. Prout are here today. Thank you for coming. You and your daughter have been victimized now 3 times. First, on that horrific night. Secondly, when Mr. Delaney, representing the school, went into court and tried to strip your daughter's anonymity, tried to out her against her wishes. And third, when the Biden administration chose to reward him by nominating him to the Court of Appeals. I would encourage everyone to read the letter that Chessie Prout has filed. And Mr. Delaney, there is a reason why virtually every Democrat has skipped this hearing. They're embarrassed about this nomination. I want to read one paragraph from this letter and ask you a final question. From Chessie Prout. If Michael Delaney is confirmed, if an attorney who has brazenly intimidated a minor victim of sexual assault is given the distinct privilege to serve as a judge for the United States Court of Appeals, you are telling victims and survivors that you not only approve of victim intimidation tactics, you reward their enactors with one of the highest legal appointments in the state of Massachusetts. She goes on to say she made this point to the Biden Justice Department. Mr. Delaney, if this committee votes to confirm you, what message does that tell every other victim of sexual assault, child victim of sexual assault, if seeking to out them publicly gets rewarded with a judicial nomination?
Thank you for the question, Senator. I have spent nearly 30 years in my legal career, half of that in public service. I have tried through my work as Attorney General and as a frontline prosecutor to represent the interests of victims in all that I did. I would ask this committee to consider the totality of my record over nearly 30 years as it reviews my qualifications.
As you know, as I observed at your confirmation hearing, you had built a long record on the Federal Court of Appeals and a reputation of being relatively nonpartisan. And so I had hopes that your tenure as Attorney General would continue that record. I have to say I'm deeply disappointed in what the last 2 years have shown. In my judgment, the Department of Justice has been politicized to the greatest extent I've ever seen in this country. And it has done a discredit to the Department of Justice, to the FBI, and to the administration of law in this country. Let me start with a simple question. General Garland, is it a federal crime to protest outside of a judge's home with the intent of influencing that judge as to a pending case?
The answer to that is yes, but I also want to at least respond to your characterization of the department, which I vigorously disagree with. I believe the men and women of the department pursue their work every single day in a nonpartisan and an appropriate way.
General Garland, there are thousands of men and women who do that, and I'll tell you, I hear from prosecutors at the Department of Justice, I hear from agents at the FBI who are angry that it is treated as the enforcement arm for the DNC instead of upholding the law in a fair and even-handed manner. So you are right. There are thousands of men and women that are doing the job, but it is the political leadership that you're responsible for. So you just said, yes, it's a crime to protest at the home of a judge. Same goes for jurors, by the way. with the intent of influencing a case. But in the wake of the leak of the Dobbs decision, when rioters descended on the homes of 6 Supreme Court justices, night after night after night, you did nothing. The department did nothing. When extremist groups like Ruth Sent Us and Jane's Revenge openly organized campaigns of harassment at the homes of justices, you sat on your hands. When these same groups posted online information about where the justices worship, or their home addresses, or where their kids went to school, you again sat on your hands and did nothing. Your failure to act to protect the safety of the justices and their families was an obvious product of political bias. You agree with Roe versus Wade. You disagree with the Dobbs decision. And the Department of Justice under this president was perfectly happy to refuse to enforce the law and allow threats of violence. And as you know, those threats finally materialized with Nicholas Roski, a 26-year-old man from California who traveled across the country, was arrested outside the home of Justice Kavanaugh, armed with a handgun, a knife, and burglary tools. And he said he came there to kill Justice Kavanaugh because he was enraged by the leaked opinion. Now, of course, you're prosecuting that individual for attempted murder, but did you bring even a single case to enforce this law, or did the Department of Justice decide this law doesn't apply if it's harassing justices for an opinion we don't like?
When the Dobbs draft was leaked, I did something no Attorney General in the history of the department had ever done before. For the first time in history, I ordered United States Marshals 24/7 to defend every residence of every justice.
Well, Garland, as a judge, you're familiar with asking counsel to answer a question.
I am answering.
Has the Department of Justice enforced this statute? Have you brought a single case against any of these protesters threatening the justices under 18 U.S.C. Section 1507? Have you brought even one?
Senator, you asked me whether I sat on my hands, and quite the opposite. I sent 70 United States Marshals.
Let me try again.
To defend.
Has the Department of Justice brought even a single case under this statute? It's a yes/no question. It's not a give a speech on the other things you did.
The job of the United States Marshals is to defend the lives of
the answer is no.
Is to defend the lives of the justices, and that's our number one priority. They have.
Why are you unwilling to say no? The answer is no. You know it's no. I know it's no. Everyone in this hearing room knows it's no. You're not willing to answer a question. Have you brought a case under this statute? Yes or no?
As far as I know, we haven't, and what we have done is defended the lives of the justices with over 70 U.S. Marshals.
How do you decide which criminal statutes the DOJ enforces and which one it doesn't?
The United States Marshals know that they have full authority.
I recognize you want to give a separate speech.
No, I don't want to give
How do you decide which statutes you enforce and which ones you don't?
The Marshals on scene make that determination in light of the priority of defense.
The Marshals do not make a determination over whether to prosecute. You, the Attorney General, make a determination, and you spent 20 years as a judge, and you're perfectly content with justices being afraid for their children's lives, and you did nothing to prosecute it. Let's shift to another area.
Can I answer the question?
No, you cannot. You have refused to answer the question.
I am answering your question. The Attorney General does not decide whether to arrest.
How did you choose not to enforce this statute?
The Marshals on scene.
Marshals don't make that decision.
They do make the decision of whether to make an arrest.
Prosecute someone? No, they don't.
If they make
Marshals do not have prosecution.
If they make an arrest, then it goes to the Marshals.
Let's change topics because our time is limited. We've also seen across the country violent attacks as pregnancy centers by similar left-wing terrorist groups, including one graffiti of a firebomb building said Jane was here. There have been attacks all over the country. And yet, the Department of Justice has not brought these violent criminals to justice. You contrast that. If you're a violent criminal and you attack a crisis pregnancy center, that is not a priority in the Biden Department of Justice. Contrast that to Mark Houck, who's a pro-life activist. He's a sidewalk counselor. And he had an altercation with someone who allegedly interfered with his son's personal space and threatened his son, and he pushed him. Now, in an ordinary world, pushing someone would be maybe a simple misdemeanor assault, but not under the Biden Department of Justice. If you're a pro-life activist, what can you expect? Well, in this instance, according to Mr. Houck's wife, 24 agents clad in body armor and ballistic helmets and shields and a battering ram showed up at his house pointing rifles at his family. Why do you send 24 agents in body armor to arrest a sidewalk counselor who happens to be pro-life, but you don't devote resources to prosecute people who are violently firebombing crisis pregnancies?
It is a priority of the department to prosecute and investigate and find the people who are doing those firebombings. They are doing it at night and in secret. And we have found one group which we did prosecute.
You found one. How many have there been? How many attacks?
There have been a lot. And if you have any information specifically as to who those people are, we would be glad. We would be glad to have that.
Did you personally authorize 20 agents going to Mr. Houck's house? And he offered to turn himself in through counsel, but you didn't want that. The Department of Justice wanted to make a show of it. Did you personally authorize it? And do you want to apologize to Mrs. Houck and her 7 children for being terrorized?
The decisions about how to do that are made at the level of the FBI agents on scene.
Did you know about it?
I did not know about it until the way you're describing it, and my understanding is the FBI disagrees with that description.
Was it a mistake?
Senator's time has expired. I'm going to allow the witness to respond to any of the questions that were asked.
Was it a mistake?
I'm going to chair the committee, Senator. I'm sorry you're not.
You said you'd allow him to respond. I repeated the question I asked, which is, was it a mistake to send 20 agents to arrest him at the crack of dawn?
You had your time and more
You just said you're going to allow him to respond. You just said, I'm going to allow him to respond to the question, so I repeated the question. Was it a mistake? That was the pending question.
You want to ask, I'll ask the questions I want.
That's the question I had already asked.
Well,
you just said you'd let him respond.
I'm going to let him respond right now. Please don't interrupt him. Thank you.
The decisions about how to do tactical arrests are made by the FBI agents in the field. The FBI has publicly stated that it disagrees with the description you gave of what happened in that example. That's the best I can answer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Monaco, welcome.
Thank you.
You have a very important job. You're the number 2 person in the Department of Justice. Every U.S. attorney reports to you. The U.S. Marshals report to you. You are responsible for day-to-day operations of the Department of Justice, and in particular, the criminal justice aspects of the Department of Justice. Is all of that correct?
That's correct.
It is unfortunate, Ms. Monaco, that as you look back over the last 2.5 years, this Department of Justice, I believe, has been the most partisan Department of Justice we've ever seen. And that is directly contrary to the mission of DOJ. DOJ is meant to be nonpartisan. It is meant to enforce the law, regardless of party. I had hopes that Merrick Garland would actually do that when he was confirmed. Those hopes have been shattered. You have been a loyal deputy standing alongside that partisan corruption of Department of Justice. You have been willing to devote massive resources to targeting individuals that are perceived to be political opponents of the White House. And you have been willing to devote 0 resources to protecting individuals who are perceived to be political opponents of the White House. I want to ask you about a statute you've been asked about already, 18 U.S.C. 1507. You're familiar with this statute?
Yes.
It's a criminal statute that says whoever with the intent of influencing any judge pickets or parades in or near a building or residences occupied or used by such judge shall be fined or imprisoned under this title or imprisoned not more than 1 year or both. Now, the entire country has seen hundreds of protesters outside the homes of Supreme Court justices night after night after night. You turn on your TV and you see violations of this criminal statute over and over and over again. How many prosecutions has DOJ brought under 18 U.S.C. Section 1507 under your leadership?
There have been no prosecutions under 1507. We're pursuing an attempted murder case against an individual who
Zero is
threatened
the answer.
Justice Kavanaugh.
I'm quite aware, and you're responsible for that, allowing these protests night after night after night. The violent threat of homicide of the individual who traveled across the country attempting to murder a Supreme Court justice, that was fueled by DOJ refusing to enforce this statute. Now, it's not an accident that DOJ refused to enforce this statute. The U.S. Marshals gave a presentation. The General Counsel's Office of the U.S. Marshals, if you look at one of the pages from that presentation, the General Counsel's Office stated the goals of the Residential and Personal Protection Mission: keep SCOTUS justices and their family free from physical harm, do not interfere with lawful First Amendment protected activity, avoid, unless absolutely necessary, criminal enforcement actions involving the protesters, particularly on public space, and making arrests and initiating prosecutions is not the goal of the Marshal's presence at SCOTUS residences. Are you familiar with this presentation?
I am. I'm familiar with the fact that the U.S. Marshal Service Director has been explicit, has been clear that the Attorney General has repeatedly directed him to enforce all federal laws, including 1507, and that his number one priority, and that of his many deputies assigned to a 24/7 security presence, is to protect the life, the safety, the property of the justices and
Did you
their
or anyone
family.
from the DAG's office meet with the U.S. Marshal Service and discuss Section 1507?
I regularly meet with the Director of the Marshal Service, the Attorney
And have you
General.
discussed 1507?
I discussed the Attorney General has been quite clear, and I have been quite clear with the Director of the Marshal Service. The
Are
Attorney
you familiar with
General's-
this presentation?
I've seen those slides, if they're the ones that Senator Britt presented to the Attorney General. But I want to be quite clear, Senator, about the direction given to the Marshal Service through the Director of the Marshal Service. He has been clear that the Attorney General directed him repeatedly to enforce all federal laws, to
With
make
respect,
his
Ms.
number
Monaco,
one
that
priority.
is demonstrably false, because this is written instruction. Making arrests and initiating prosecution is not the goal. That's not an instruction to enforce the law. That is exactly the opposite. It is 180 degrees. It is instructing them. It is not the goal to arrest anybody, despite the fact that the criminal statute said they shall be imprisoned. You made a political decision, Merrick Garland made a political decision, that because you agree with the protesters, you don't like the decision the Supreme Court justices made, the marshals were instructed, don't arrest anyone and don't enforce federal law. Isn't that correct?
That is not correct, because the Attorney General and I and the Marshal Service Director are so concerned about potential threats to the justices. The Attorney General directed in an unprecedented step, 24/7.
Not what this says in writing.
24/7.
What does this say in writing?
I don't have the right glasses on for that, but Senator, the Attorney General was very clear with the Director of the Marshal Service, and the Marshal Service Director has said the same thing.
The word
that
not is even underlined.
The number one priority given to the Marshal Service for their unprecedented protection detail for the Supreme Court justices is to protect their life, their
But
safety,
to
and
ignore
their property.
1507,
To protect their life, their
to
safety.
ignore federal criminal law.
Respectfully disagree with that characterization.
That's what
sir.
the written instruction says. Not is underlined. Do not make arrests. Do not initiate prosecutions. Up is not down.
The Director of the Marshal Service has been very clear. The Attorney General directed him to enforce all federal laws, but that his number one priority is to ensure the safety
Ms. Monaco,
and the
what you're
protection.
saying is objectively false. Good morning, Secretary Mayorkas.
Good morning.
Is there a crisis at our southern border?
Senator, there is a very significant...
That's a yes or no question.
There's a very significant...
Is there a crisis?
Senator, there's a very significant challenge...
I think
that
your
we are
microphone is not
confronting.
on.
There is a very significant challenge that we are facing...
Yes or no,
at the
is
southern
there a
border.
crisis?
I believe I've addressed that question,
So you're
Senator.
refusing to answer.
Senator, there is a very significant challenge, and
Will
we
you
are
answer if there's a
therefore-
crisis?
Therefore, we are dedicating the resources.
Okay, so you're refusing
that
to answer. Well, Secretary Mayorkas, I'll tell you someone who is willing to answer, which is your and President Biden's chief of the Border Patrol in a sworn deposition in July of 2022 when asked, would you agree, Chief Ortiz, that the southern border is currently in crisis? Answer, yes. Notice none of those wiggle words, none of that equivocation. One word, one syllable, yes. Are you willing to speak with the same clarity as Chief Ortiz? Is there a crisis at our southern border, yes or no?
Senator, I'm very proud to work alongside.
So you
and
refuse to
support-
answer. Let me ask you the next question. Has the crisis at our southern border made Americans less safe, yes or no?
Senator, we are dedicated to the safety
Has
and
the crisis
security
made Americans less
of
safe? I don't want a discourse. It's a yes or no question.
Senator, we have a challenge of
You refuse to
immigration.
answer the question.
Not-
Mr. Secretary, let me show you how someone doing his job answers a question in a straightforward manner. Chief Ortiz, is the crisis that is currently ongoing at the southern border making the border less safe for Americans and aliens alike? Answer, yes. One word, one syllable, 3 letters. That's how someone answers a question and does their job. You're being a politician misleading the American people. Let me give you a chance again. Will you show the same integrity Chief Ortiz shows? Is the crisis at the southern border making Americans less safe? Yes or no?
Senator, we have 260,000
You refuse to
people
answer the
dedicated-
question. Let's move on.
And security of the
Next
American
question, Mr. Mayorkas. Has the crisis made aliens less safe? Yes or no?
Senator, we are seeking.
So you won't answer that question either.
If you-
It's a yes or no. Has it made aliens less safe?
Senator, smugglers are exploiting.
Has the
vulnerable
crisis
migrants.
made aliens, yes, less safe? Are you willing to answer it?
Senator, the smuggling organizations.
Okay, you're
seek to
filibustering again. Let me ask you this question. How many migrants have died under President Biden?
Senator, your phrasing of the question is actually quite misleading.
How many migrants died in 2022?
Approaching our southern border?
Yes.
Precisely why we are seeking to
So
exclude the
do
smuggling
you know the answer? Do you know how many died?
I do not.
You do not. Of course you don't. I know how many died. 853.
That is
853. And by the way, here are the numbers that have died every year. You go back to 1998, you see it's consistently between 300 and 400, 300, 400, 300, 400. Suddenly, 2021, what happens? You get in office, and that red line are dead bodies. I've been on the Rio Grande, and I've seen dead bodies floating there who've drowned because of your refusal to do your job. You don't even know how many have died. What do you say to the Texas farmers and ranchers who find pregnant ladies dead on their property, who find toddlers dead on their property? What do you say to them?
I say that is why precisely we are taking it to the smuggling organizations.
But you are not. That is simply not true.
Number two, it is why we are dedicated.
Let me read from the Wall Street Journal. The Wall Street Journal 2 weeks ago ran an article entitled, "It's like a graveyard. Record numbers of migrants are dying at the border." The story begins with this chilling line, quote, Eagle Pass, Texas. Local officials keep a refrigerated truck to hold the bodies of migrants who drown in the currents of the Rio Grande while trying to cross the border into the U.S. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that this article be entered into the record. Let me ask you a different question. How many children have been sexually assaulted by human traffickers under the Biden administration?
Senator, this is precisely why we instituted.
I don't want a lecture. It's a question. How many children have been sexually assaulted by human traffickers under your administration?
Senator, this is exactly why on January 5th we announced the parole
do you know how
program.
many? Do you know how many children have been sexually assaulted?
This is why we.
Okay, you're going to refuse to answer that question as well. Let's move on. It's obvious you've been instructed to stonewall, so I'm not going to let you. You don't get to stonewall and filibuster. Now, one of my Democratic colleagues before said the Democrat talking point, quote, "This problem didn't start under Biden." Look, I get if you're a partisan spinner, you got to figure out something to say about the absolute catastrophe that has played out under the Biden administration. True or false, Secretary Mayorkas, 2020 was the lowest rate of illegal immigration in 45 years. Is that true or false?
It is certainly the lowest level of immigration in many, many years. And what was it
Okay, fine.
in 2020? What was it, Senator, in 2020 that impacted the entire world, including the United States?
Okay, so your
What
testimony
was-
is the reason we had the lowest rate was COVID. It had nothing to do with building the wall, nothing to do with ending catch and release, nothing to do with Remain in Mexico. With all respect, Mr. Secretary, that answer is laughable. And in fact, if you look at illegal immigration, let's look at CBP encounters. You can see 500,000, 500,000, it drops to the lowest level, and boom, what happens? You show up. And that red line is you. That red line is Joe Biden. And you're claiming nothing happened. Oh gosh, this was here before us. No, you made the decision to allow this to happen. Let me ask you, we now have over 5.5 million people who've entered this country illegally under Joe Biden. How many murderers have you released into America?
Senator, I'm not aware of any murderer whom we've.
So you don't
released Senator, let me say something.
Do you know?
If you take a look at.
No, you don't get to give a speech. Do you know how many murderers you've released?
I'm just trying to answer your question.
How many rapists
Senator.
have you released?
Senator, I'm trying
Do you
to
know?
answer your question.
You can answer, I know or I don't know.
Senator, any individual who poses a public safety threat.
How many child
is
molesters have you
detained
released?
and removed into the United States, from the United States.
Oh, so your testimony under oath, subject to perjury, is that you have not released any murderers, rapists, or child molesters among the 5.5 million? Is that your testimony?
Mr. Chairman, may I have the opportunity
No,
to
you may
act-
not. You may answer my question.
You're not
Is
allowing-
that your testimony, yes or no?
Senator, you're not allowing me to answer your question.
I am allowing you to answer. I'm not allowing you to filibuster.
If you take a look at the pace of immigration in 2018 to 2019.
You're refusing
you
to
will see
answer. Let's move on. Let's
you will
move on
see-
to gotaways. Gotaways are the people that get away that you know about. Now, what happened under your administration? Gotaways consistently down at this low line, boom, you get in. And they go from below 180,000 to 600,000. Now, I'll tell you this about a gotaway. You don't know among those 600,000 a year, you have no idea how many are murderers, correct?
That is precisely why the number of
Correct?
gotaways.
Do you know how many of those are murderers?
That is precisely
So you
why.
refuse to answer the question. You know how many are rapists? Do you know how many are rapists? This is a question. You're a lawyer. You know how to answer questions. Of the 600,000, do you know how many of them were rapists?
Senator, this is why we
So again,
are.
the answer is no. Let me ask you this. Do you know how many of them are terrorists? And I don't want to, Senator, here's my lecture on this. Do you know how many of the 600,000 gotaways were terrorists? Yes or no?
Senator, we are focused on the.
You
safety
refuse
and
to answer
security.
that as well. What's the result of massive gotaways? Well, one of the results is drug overdoses. And we now have, last year, over 100,000 overdoses who died, the majority from Chinese fentanyl streaming across the border. Now, you told Senator Cornyn, you care, but look what has happened under your policy. When you open up the border to the worst illegal immigration in our nation's history, people die. You claim you care. Mr. Secretary, that is a lie. You know, some months ago, Karine Jean-Pierre stood up at a White House briefing and said, people are not just walking across the border. Was she telling the truth?
Senator, you are
Was she telling the
so
truth?
profoundly disrespecting.
Was she telling
my
the truth?
22 years
Okay,
of government service.
you get to answer questions. You don't
Senator-
get to give speeches.
Senator, I served as a federal prosecutor.
All right,
for
you're
12
refusing
years.
to answer. If you look at, she was lying, and she was not lying on her own. She was lying on behalf of the President of the United States. Now, the photograph of people walking. She was lying on behalf of the President of the United States. This is a photograph from just one day along the Rio Grande of hundreds of thousands of people walking across the border. You have allowed this to happen. The photograph that was before, what are these wristbands?
I don't know what they are.
You
Senator.
don't know what they are. Mr. Secretary, you have just testified to the American people you're incompetent at your job, because I've been to the southern border, and if you go to the southern border, along the southern border, you see thousands of these wristbands because the illegal immigrants wear them. The drug cartels, every color corresponds to how many thousands of dollars they owe the cartels. You have turned these cartels into multi-billion-dollar criminal organizations, and these are modern-day leg irons because these are children being sold into sex slavery, and you don't even know what they are. That is astonishing. Mr. Secretary, how many children have been sold into sex slavery under your administration?
Senator, we are taking it to the cartels.
How many
and the
children have been
smuggling
sold into sex slavery?
in an
Do you know how many children have been
unprecedented-
sold into sex slavery?
to an unprecedented degree?
Mr. Secretary, I want to say to you right now,
It is
your
precisely-
behavior is disgraceful, and the deaths, the children assaulted, the children raped, they are at your feet, and if you had integrity, you would resign. And I will tell you, the men and women of the Border Patrol, they've never had a political leader undermine them. They despise you, Mr. Secretary, because you're willing to let children be raped to follow political orders. This is a crisis, it's a disgrace, and you won't even admit this human tragedy is a crisis.